The ninth process of the build, acquire and implement domain called manage assets, has 5 practices. The second practice is to manage critical assets. The entities that are responsible for this practice are the IT head architect, the head of IT development, and the head of IT administration. The entity that is held accountable is the head of IT operations. The practice receives no inputs, but generates 2 outputs, which are the communication of planned maintenance downtime to be used by the AP08 process, and the maintenance agreements to be used internally. The activities involved in this practice include identifying the assets that are critical for service delivery. The performance of critical assets should be monitored, and action should be taken when needed. The risks affecting the critical assets should be regularly assessed, and preventive maintenance should be performed. The maintenance plan should take the cost-benefit analysis into consideration, as well as the vendor recommendations. Service agreements should be established, while accounting for third-party access and authorization. The impact of the maintenance activities should be assessed and communicated, such as any downtime that could affect the business. The third practice is to manage the asset lifecycle. The entities that are responsible are the head of IT administration, and the IT service manager. The entity that is held accountable is the head of IT operations. The practice receives no inputs, but generates 3 outputs, which are the approved asset procurement requests to be used internally, the asset register revisions to be used by the BAI10 process, and the authorized asset retirements to be used by the BAI10 process. The activities involved in this practice include procuring the assets based on the approved requests, and according to the procurement policies. All asset records should be maintained, and assets should be physically labeled. The procurement process should be completed with the supplier based on the agreed-on conditions. The assets should then be deployed and tested, and then allocated to their relevant users. The users should understand their responsibilities and sign off an acceptable use document. When no longer required, assets should be retired or disposed of securely. The fourth practice is to optimize asset costs. The entities that are responsible include the IT head architect, the head of IT development, and the IT service manager. The entity that is held accountable is the Chief Information Officer. The practice receives no inputs, but generates 2 outputs, which are the results of cost optimization reviews, and the opportunities to reduce asset costs or increase value, both to be used by the AP02 process. The activities involved in this practice include assessing the maintenance costs of the assets, and taking into consideration alternative options such as replacements. The asset warranties and value for money should be determined, and lower costs of procurements should be considered. Underutilized assets should be identified, using capacity statistics. Emerging technologies should be considered if possible, along with alternative sourcing options. The fifth and last practice is to manage licenses. The entities that are responsible include the audit function, the head of IT development, and the head of IT administration. The entity that is held accountable is the Chief Information Officer. The practice receives no inputs, but it generates 3 outputs, which are the register of software licenses to be used by the BAI10 process, the results of installed license audits to be used by the MEA3 process, and the action plan to adjust license numbers and allocations to be used by the AP02 process. The activities involved in this practice include maintaining a register of all purchased software licenses. Regular audits should be performed to ensure that the number of owned licenses is similar to the number of used licenses. Unutilized licenses should be retained for future purposes or terminated to save costs. Other sources that provide further insights into this process include the ITIL framework.